Sir, step away from the counter. I'm gonna need you to come with me.
I don't care what you say. This transaction isn't going through.
Sir, my name is Darnell Okafor. That check is from my company. You can verify it right now.
Sir, I need you to step away from the counter. I'm going to need you to come with me. I don't care what you say. This transaction cannot be processed. Sir, my name is Darnell Okafor. I am the owner of Okafor Construction and Development, LLC. That is my company's check. That is my company's account. My name is on the charter, on the operating agreement, on the tax filings, and on the signature card your bank has had on file for 6 years. I need you to step back from the counter and lower your voice. I am not raising my voice. I am telling you who I am, and I need you to tell me why that is not enough. Darnell Marcus Okafor had built Okafor Construction and Development, LLC from a single work truck and a $12,000 personal loan into a mid-size commercial construction firm operating across 4 counties in the greater Atlanta metropolitan area. He had started the company at 29 years old with a contractor's license, a client he had found by knocking on office park doors, and the specific discipline of a man who had watched his father work 31 years for a company that laid him off 11 months before his pension vested, and decided that no institution would ever hold that kind of authority over his life again. He had grown the company over 11 years. He had 17 full-time employees, 9 of whom were black men from the same neighborhood in southwest Atlanta where Darnell had grown up. He had completed contracts for 3 school districts, 2 hospital systems, a regional airport terminal expansion, and the ground floor commercial build-out of a mixed-use development in Buckhead that had been featured in Atlanta Business Chronicle under the headline "The Builder Who Doesn't Miss Deadlines." He had banked at First Consolidated Trust of Georgia for 6 years. He had processed hundreds of transactions at this branch. His account held a balance that would have made the branch manager's quarterly numbers look considerably better than they were. He had never, in 6 years, been treated as a suspect inside this building, until the afternoon of June 17th, when a $340,000 completion payment from the Fulton County School District, the final draw on a 14-month school renovation contract, issued on official county government check stock, signed by the district's chief financial officer, accompanied by the contract completion documentation that Darnell had carried into the branch in a manila folder, because he had learned that transactions of this size sometimes required supporting. Paperwork was handed across the counter to a teller named Ashley Greer, who looked at the check, looked at the man who had handed it, and called the branch manager before she had entered a single digit into her terminal. What happened in the next 53 minutes was captured on the bank's interior security cameras, on the body cameras of the 2 Atlanta Police Department officers who responded to the branch manager's call, on the phone of a commercial loan officer named Sandra Tate, who worked 3 desks from the manager's office and began recording the moment she heard the words being used and understood what she was watching, and on the personal phone of one of Darnell's employees, a project manager named Leon Briggs, who had driven Darnell to the branch and was waiting in the parking lot and walked inside at minute 31 when Darnell had not come back out. Those recordings would be reviewed by a federal judge, entered into evidence in a civil lawsuit filed in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia, and result in an $11 million verdict that triggered regulatory review of First Consolidated Trust's fraud flagging protocols by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Office of the Controller of the Currency simultaneously. Before we go any further, where are you watching from tonight? Hit that subscribe button if you're new here. Stories like this one are exactly why this channel exists, and your support is what makes it possible to keep telling them. The branch manager's name was Patricia Holloway. She had managed the Cascade Road branch of First Consolidated Trust for 4 years. She had standard banking fraud prevention training, standard anti-money laundering certification, and what her performance reviews described as strong customer relationship instincts. She had processed large check deposits before. She had approved transactions in excess of $300,000 before. She had done so, according to the transaction records subpoenaed during discovery, on 7 occasions in the 14 months preceding June 17th. 6 of which involved white business owners presenting checks of comparable or greater value with no police call, no extended verification request, and no removal from the premises. The 7th was Darnell Ockhaffer. The branch's interior security camera recorded his arrival at 2:14 p.m. He was wearing a pressed Oxford shirt, dark slacks, and the kind of leather portfolio that a man carries when he knows he is conducting serious business and has prepared accordingly. He greeted the teller by name. He had been coming to this branch for 6 years and knew the staff, placed the check on the counter, and slid the manila folder of supporting documentation across alongside it without being asked. Because he had learned that transactions of this size sometimes prompted questions, and he had come with the answers already organized. The teller, Ashley Greer, picked up the check. The camera recorded her face, a flicker of something, a recalibration. A pause that lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have for a teller looking at a check from a verified account holder she had processed transactions for before. She said she needed to get her manager. She was gone for 90 seconds. Patricia Holloway came to the counter at 2:16 p.m. She looked at the check. She looked at Darnell. She said she had some concerns about the transaction and asked him to step into her office. Darnell followed her. His portfolio was under his arm. His manila folder was in his hand. He sat in the chair across from her desk with the posture of a man who has conducted a great many business meetings and understands that patience is sometimes the price of getting what you came for. Holloway told him that a deposit of this size required additional verification. He opened his folder. He placed the Fulton County School District contract on her desk. He placed the completion certification on her desk. He placed the county CFO's accompanying letter on her desk. He placed his business license, his EIN documentation, and the operating agreement showing his name as sole member of Ockhaffer Construction and Development, LLC, on her desk. He had brought all of it. He had organized it in the sequence he expected she would need it. Holloway looked at the documents. Then she looked at Darnell. Then she said she needed to make a call. "What kind of call?" he asked. "A verification call," she said, "to confirm the legitimacy of the issuing account." "The issuing account," Darnell said, with the specific patience of a man managing an emotion that he already understands will be used against him if it surfaces, "is the Fulton County School District. Their phone number is on the check, on the contract, and on the CFO's letter." "Would you like me to point to it?" Holloway said she would handle the verification herself and asked him to wait in the lobby. He waited in the lobby for 19 minutes. The security camera recorded him sitting in one of the branch's leather waiting chairs with his portfolio on his knee and his folder in his lap, watching the door to Holloway's office with the expression of a person who is doing a specific kind of internal accounting, adding up what is happening against what should be happening and arriving at a number that does not balance. At 2:35 p.m., 2 Atlanta Police Department officers entered the branch. Their body cameras were active. The recordings showed them being directed to Holloway's office, a 90-second conversation that the cameras captured in partial audio, and then both officers walking toward the lobby where Darnell was sitting. He stood when he saw them. The camera recorded his face, the same expression that had been documented in other cases, in other cities, in other recordings that have been viewed by millions of people who recognized it immediately, because it is not unique to Darnell Ockhaffer. It is the expression of a black man who has just watched a situation he already understood become a situation he can no longer manage with patience alone. "Sir," the first officer said, "we need to ask you some questions about this transaction." "I am Darnell Ockhaffer," he said. "I am the owner of Ockhaffer Construction and Development, LLC. That check is a completion payment from the Fulton County School District for a contract I have been executing for 14 months. Every document verifying that fact is currently on the branch manager's desk. I have been a customer of this bank for 6 years. I have not done anything wrong. We understand. We just need to verify some information." "What information has not already been verified by the stack of documents on that desk?" The second officer asked him to step outside to continue the conversation. And here is where the recording captures something that transcends the specific facts of June 17th and enters the territory of something much older and much larger. Because Darnell Ockhaffer looked at those two officers, and then he looked through the branch window at the parking lot, where his project manager, Leon Briggs, was now standing outside his truck watching through the glass, and then he looked at the other customers in the lobby, watching. Recording on phones they had raised with the particular instinct of people who understood what they were seeing, and then he looked back at the officers and said, very quietly, "I would like to call my attorney before I go anywhere," he called. His attorney, a woman named Renata Simmons, who had been his business counsel for 4 years, was in his ear within 40 seconds. She told him to comply, to say nothing further, and that she was on her way. He was escorted out of the branch at 2:49 p.m. 35 minutes after he had walked in with a legitimate check, a 6-year banking relationship, and a manila folder full of documentation that answered every question anyone might have thought to ask. He walked through the lobby and through the glass doors and into the parking lot in front of Leon Briggs, who was recording on his phone. His face carrying the particular expression of a man watching something happen to someone he works for and respects and cannot stop. Leon Briggs had worked for Darnell Ockhaffer for 7 years. He had been on the school renovation project from the first day of groundbreaking to the final inspection. The $340,000 check that was currently sitting on Patricia Holloway's desk represented, in part, the payroll that would cover his salary and the salary of 16 other people for the next month. He kept recording. Renata Simmons arrived at the branch at 3:04 p.m. She walked in with the specific velocity of an attorney who has received a phone call that she knew, the moment she heard the facts, was going to become the most significant case of her professional career. She was in Holloway's office for 11 minutes. The security camera recorded the conversation through the glass, Simmons placing documents on the desk, speaking with the controlled precision of a person who is simultaneously managing her client's immediate situation and building the foundation of a legal argument. Holloway's expression moving through a sequence that the camera captured in sufficient resolution to matter later. At 3:17 p.m., 1 hour and 3 minutes after Darnell Ockhaffer had first placed his check on the counter, First Consolidated Trust of Georgia processed the deposit. The formal complaint was filed with First Consolidated Trust's corporate headquarters the following morning. Simmons arrived at the regional VP's office with a printed timeline, copies of all documentation Darnell had presented, and a USB drive containing the branch security camera footage she had formally requested under the bank's customer record access policy. She placed everything on the desk and sat down. "I want to walk you through what happened yesterday," she said, "and then I want you to explain to me why it happened. And then I want to discuss what happens next, because I promise you that what happens next is going to be determined by what you say in this room in the next 30 minutes. The regional VP watched the footage. He watched it twice. Then he called the bank's chief legal officer. Then he called corporate compliance. The meeting lasted 4 hours. First Consolidated Trust's initial response was an internal review, a statement expressing regret that the customer experience had not met their standards, and an offer of a fee waiver on Darnell's account for 12 months. Simmons filed the federal lawsuit the following week. She retained co-counsel, a civil rights litigator named Marcus Webb SR. From a firm with 38 years of financial discrimination cases, former counsel to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's Economic Justice Division. A man who had argued banking discrimination cases before the 11th Circuit and whose name, when it appeared on a filing, caused defense teams to begin settlement conversations before the discovery phase. Webb SR watched all 4 recordings in sequence. He reviewed the 7 comparable large check transactions from the preceding 14 months. He obtained the branch's fraud flagging logs through discovery and found that in the 18 months preceding June 17th, the branch had called law enforcement in connection with a fraud concern on 4 occasions. All 4 involved black customers. He reviewed Holloway's training records and found no documented protocol for when law enforcement contact was appropriate versus when standard verification procedures were sufficient. "There are 3 things this case is about," he told Darnell at their first meeting. "There is a teller who looked at a black man with a large check and saw something that needed to be escalated before she processed a single digit. There is a branch manager who looked at a stack of documentation that answered every question and called the police anyway. And there is a bank that built fraud protocols without any mechanism for examining whether those protocols were being applied consistently across customers of different races, and whose own. Transaction records prove they were not. He paused. All three are actionable, and the transaction records are going to do more damage in that courtroom than anything else we put in front of that jury, because numbers do not have a narrative. They just are. The federal lawsuit was filed in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. Darnell Marcus Ockafer and Ockafer Construction and Development, LLC versus First Consolidated Trust of Georgia, Patricia Holloway individually, and Ashley Greer individually. The complaint alleged racial discrimination under 42 U.S.C. Section 1981, violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, violation of the Fair Housing Act's financial services provisions, negligent supervision and training, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference with business operations, a count that documented the specific reputational harm caused by a business owner being escorted from a bank branch by police officers in front of his own employee, in a neighborhood where his professional reputation was the primary currency of his continued business development. That final count cited Leon Briggs's footage specifically. It cited the 17 employees whose payroll was contingent on the deposit being processed. It cited 3 prospective clients in the Cascade Road business community who had witnessed or heard about the incident within 48 hours and, according to documented communications entered into evidence, reconsidered pending contract discussions with Ockafer Construction as a result. The bank's initial settlement offer was $200,000. Web SR sent back 4 words, "We'll see you there." The trial began 17 months later. The courtroom held every day what the corridor outside also held: Black business owners and entrepreneurs who had taken personal days, members of Atlanta's professional and financial community, employees of Ockafer Construction who attended in rotating shifts so the business could continue operating, representatives from the National Black Chamber of Commerce and the Georgia NAACP who had filed supporting briefs, banking equity advocates, law students from Emory and Georgia State who had followed the case through every filing, and national media that had covered the story since Leon Briggs's parking lot footage generated 81 million views in 9 days. Leon Briggs sat in the gallery every day of the trial. He wore his Ockafer Construction work shirt. He did not take it off for the courtroom. Darnell Ockafer sat at the plaintiff's table in the same Oxford shirt and dark slacks he had worn on June 17th. The manila folder, the original one with the original documents in the original sequence, was on the table in front of him. Simmons had suggested it. Darnell had agreed immediately. The footage was played on the first morning. All 4 recordings, synchronized and time-stamped, on a screen large enough for every person in the courtroom to read the expressions. The jury watched a man in a pressed Oxford shirt with a leather portfolio and a manila folder full of documentation sit in a bank lobby for 19 minutes while a branch manager made a phone call. That resulted in 2 police officers walking through the front door. They watched him stand up when he saw the officers, with the specific quality of stillness that people who have seen it before recognize immediately, not surprise, not panic. The stillness of a man who saw this coming from the moment the teller picked up the phone, and who has been managing it ever since with everything he has. They watched him be escorted through the lobby, through the glass doors, and into the parking lot in front of his project manager, who was recording on his phone with the expression of a man who is watching something that he will not stop seeing for a long time. They watched the deposit be processed 1 hour and 3 minutes after it was presented, after an attorney arrived and sat in the branch manager's office for 11 minutes. 5 jurors were visibly emotional when the footage ended. The others wore the expression of people who have just had a number explained to them and understand exactly what it means. Darnell testified for 6 hours over 2 days. He described the company, the work truck, the $12,000 loan, the 11 years, the 17 employees, 9 of them from the neighborhood where he grew up, the school renovation project. The 14 months, the final inspection, the county CFO signing the check. He described driving to the branch with the manila folder already organized, already anticipating the questions, already prepared to be the version of himself that institutions require before they will treat him like what he is. "I have been preparing for that meeting my entire career," he told the jury, his voice carrying the flat precision of a man who has had 17 months to understand what he is saying and has chosen every word accordingly. Not that specific meeting, every transaction. Every room I walk into where I am the only person who looks like me, and I need the people in that room to see what I have built before they see what they assume. He paused. I brought documentation that answered every question they could have asked. I had been a customer of that bank for 6 years. My account balance was on their screen. The check was from a county government. The contract was in the folder. The CFO's letter was in the folder. My business license was in the folder. Another pause. They called the police. And I need this jury to sit with the specific question of what, exactly, was not in that folder that would have made the outcome different. Because I have been asking myself that question for 17 months. And the only answer I have found is that the thing missing from that folder is something I cannot put in a folder. He described the moment he saw the officers walk in. He described looking through the window at Leon Briggs in the parking lot. He described being escorted out. "I have 17 employees," he said. 9 of them grew up where I grew up. They work for me because I built something that could employ them. When I walked through that lobby with those officers, I walked past the reason I built it. And I need you to understand what it costs a man to be made into a suspect in front of the people he is responsible for. Not just the business cost, the cost that doesn't have a number. The cost of having to drive back to the job site that afternoon and look the people who depend on you in the eye and explain what just happened to you at the bank. He stopped. Leon didn't need an explanation. He was there. He saw it. That was the worst part. The expert witnesses were exhaustive. A banking industry specialist testified that First Consolidated Trust's fraud flagging protocol contained no documented threshold distinguishing when law enforcement contact was appropriate versus when standard verification was sufficient, a gap he described as a structural failure present in a significant number of regional bank systems and disproportionate in its application to black business customers. A statistical analyst presented the transaction comparison data. 7 large check deposits in 14 months, 6 processed without incident, 1 resulting in a police call. The single differentiating variable being the race of the account holder. A racial bias researcher from Georgia Tech presented findings from a national study of bank fraud escalation patterns, showing a statistically significant disparity in law enforcement contact rates for black customers presenting large transactions compared to white customers presenting transactions of equivalent or greater value. A business valuation expert calculated the documented impact on Acafer Construction's pipeline. 3 prospective contracts totaling $2.1 million in projected revenue that had been paused or redirected following the incident, supported by email documentation entered into evidence. The defense argued that Holloway had been following fraud prevention protocol, that large transactions require additional verification, and that the police contact had been a precautionary measure that any branch manager might reasonably take in an uncertain situation. Webb SR addressed each argument in his closing with the methodical precision of a man who has been building to this moment for 17 months. Patricia Holloway's fraud prevention protocol, he told the jury, contained no documented threshold for when police contact was appropriate. That is First Consolidated Trust's failure, not a defense. It is evidence. Evidence that the bank built a system in which a branch manager's individual judgment determined when law enforcement was called, without any mechanism for examining whether that judgment was being applied consistently. And their own transaction records, 7 deposits, 6 processed, 1 policed, tell you exactly how that unexamined judgment operated in practice. He paused. Large transactions require additional verification. Correct. Darnell Acafer brought that verification. He organized it in a folder. He placed it on the desk. He sat in the lobby for 19 minutes while the branch manager looked at documentation that answered every question, and then made a phone call that resulted in 2 officers walking through the front door. The verification was not the issue. The verification was complete before the call was made, which means the call was not about the transaction. Another pause longer. And the police contact was a precautionary measure any branch manager might reasonably take. The defense would like you to accept that framing. I would like you to consider it from inside the lobby. From inside the manila folder that answered every question. From inside the 11 years that built the company whose check was sitting on that desk. From inside the faces of 17 employees whose payroll was contingent on a deposit that a branch manager decided, after reviewing complete documentation, still required police intervention. Darnell Ockhaffer told you what was missing from that folder. He told you it was something he could not put in a folder. I am asking you to put a number on what that costs. Because the bank's own records already proved what caused it. The jury deliberated for 8 days. When they returned, the courtroom held more people than fire code comfortably permitted. Darnell Ockhaffer sat at the plaintiff's table in his Oxford shirt, the manila folder in front of him. His hands flat on the table with the stillness of a man who built 11 years of a company on the specific discipline of not letting what is happening on the outside determine what is happening on the inside. Renata Simmons sat beside him. Leon Briggs was in the gallery in his Ockhaffer construction work shirt, in the same seat he had occupied every day of the trial, liable on all counts, every count. Against First Consolidated Trust of Georgia, against Patricia Holloway individually, against Ashley Greer individually. The sound in the courtroom was not an eruption. It was the sound of a room full of people releasing something that had been held for a long time. Entrepreneurs and business owners who knew exactly what was in that manila folder because they had carried versions of it into rooms their entire careers. Who understood what Darnell meant when he said it contained everything except the thing that would have made the difference. Who had been sitting in that gallery for 17 months, waiting for a jury to put a number on something they had always known was real. Darnell sat perfectly still. He looked at the folder on the table. He put one hand on it, flat, the way a man touches something that has been through something with him. Simmons put her hand on his shoulder. He nodded once. The damages phase lasted 7 days. $4.7 million in compensatory damages. For reputational harm, emotional distress. The documented pipeline loss of $2.1 million in prospective contracts. And the specific calculable cost of a business owner's time and professional standing during a 53-minute detention in his own bank branch. $6.3 million in punitive damages against First Consolidated Trust of Georgia for systemic protocol failure, inadequate training, and the statistical pattern of discriminatory fraud escalation documented in the transaction records. Total $11 million. The verdict restructured the industry conversation. Patricia Holloway was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours and did not return. First Consolidated Trust, under simultaneous regulatory review by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, announced a complete overhaul of its fraud escalation protocols, mandatory documentation review thresholds before any law enforcement contact, an independent equity audit of all large transaction flagging patterns across its branch network, mandatory implicit bias training for all customer-facing staff, and a standing third-party review of escalation decisions involving black customers presenting large transactions. The OCC issued supervisory guidance, citing the case and directing all nationally chartered banks to review their large transaction verification protocols for discriminatory application patterns. The CFPB opened a broader inquiry into fraud escalation practices at regional banks nationwide, citing the statistical evidence entered into the Ockhaffer trial as the basis for the investigation. The American Bankers Association issued a statement and announced a working group on equitable fraud prevention protocols co-chaired, at the working group's own request, by Renata Simmons. Darnell Ockhaffer used a portion of his settlement to establish the Open Account Fund, providing legal resources and business support to Black entrepreneurs who face financial discrimination in banking and lending settings. He testified before the Senate Banking Committee on equitable access to financial services. He was appointed to the Georgia Department of Banking and Finance's Consumer Equity Advisory Panel. He delivered the keynote address at the National Black Chamber of Commerce's annual conference. In his Oxford shirt, his leather portfolio under his arm, his manila folder on the podium. Ockafer Construction and Development, LLC, completed 3 new contracts in the 18 months following the verdict. Leon Briggs was promoted to Director of Field Operations. 2 of the 3 prospective clients who had paused discussions following the June 17th incident reached back out after the verdict. One of them sent a handwritten letter. Darnell kept it in the manila folder. He still banks at the same branch. The branch now has documented escalation thresholds, a standing equity review of all fraud flagging decisions, and a protocol that was written, in part, in response to the case of a man who was once escorted out of it for having too much documentation and not enough of the thing that documentation cannot provide. Leon Briggs still drives him sometimes. They do not talk about June 17th very often. Once, on the way back from a job site, Briggs told Darnell that the thing he remembered most about that afternoon was not the officers or the lobby or the parking lot. It was the folder. It was watching Darnell walk out of the bank with the folder still under his arm, every document still inside it, completely organized, completely legitimate, completely ignored, and the way Darnell held it the same way on the way out that he had held it on the way in. Like it still meant what it meant, like the folder's truth was not dependent on whether the branch manager had chosen to read it. That's the thing about documentation, Darnell told him. It doesn't change based on who decides to look at it. It just waits. The recordings, all 4, synchronized and time-stamped, became required training material at banking compliance programs, financial services equity courses, and federal examiner certification curricula across the country. A 53-minute case study in what financial discrimination looks like when it is not a slur or a locked door or an outright refusal, when it is simply a phone call made after the documentation has already answered every question by a person who looked at a Black man with a large check and arrived at a conclusion that the documents in front of her could not correct, because the conclusion was never really about the documents. In Atlanta and far beyond, Darnell Ockafer's case became a landmark, proof that building something is not enough, that documentation is not enough. That 6 years and a perfect banking relationship and a folder full of verification is not enough when the assumption is already formed before the first question is asked. And proof that the record of what happened, on body cameras, on security footage, on a phone held steady by a project manager in a parking lot who understood immediately what he was watching, does not disappear just because the institution that created it would prefer it to. The record was always watching. The record always wins. If you believe that a business owner's credentials should open any door, that a manila folder full of documentation should be read before a phone call is made, and that 53 minutes is long enough to change everything, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because tomorrow we have another story where the camera told the truth and the truth changed the outcome. The record is always watching, and the record always wins.